Welcome to the Overton Pod. Kanthan, good day.
How are you doing, John?
I'm good. I'm well.
You seem to have survived the fast. How was Passover?
The fast? No fast. Way too much eating. Some restrictions, but overall,
You're a fallen Jew, my friend.
a fallen Jew. Why? Oh, the fast before. Which fast are you referring to? Carry on, and I shall hoist you by your own petard.
Aren't you supposed to fast before you feast?
No. So there actually are a whole bunch of fasts. I'm not very familiar with anyone before Passover, but there's kind of biblical fasts and there's rabbinical fasts. So there's ones that are kind of mandated in the Bible, Old Testament stuff. And then there's stuff that's the rabbis through the centuries decided to add in. So I don't really pay attention.
So you've reinforced my point, okay? Because one of the things that I've been saying over the years, you know that if you visit Jews or Indians, you're going to get fed.
No, this is a severe problem. Jewish festivals are basically just eating. I mean, Passover is essentially, that's the idea. You sit down and you have a dinner. It's, the Seder is what you do, and there's a whole bunch of rituals to it. But essentially, you have a big feast. Rosh Hashanah, which is New Year, is no different. Same story. You end up eating way too much. And then all the festivals in between generally have some food related to them. I mean, Hanukkah has potato latkes, which are very delicious. And Purim, which was not too long ago, which is the one where everyone dresses up, has these sort of triangular bread things with fillings, cheese or sweet fillings, jam.
Yeah,
what
do you call those things?
Hamantashen.
Hamantashen, that's right. No, I do remember. Yes, I was trying to remember. Yes, yeah, they're actually very tasty.
Yeah. So no, it's all food. Yeah, I mean the Indian side is no different, I assume.
Well, we've now gone down this food rabbit hole, so we could probably spend quite a while talking about recipes and what we end up doing for very specific occasions.
Absolutely cannot spend any time talking about recipes because I have no idea how to make any of this stuff. I'm pretty useless.
My mother, I must tell you,
regard.
has written an entire book that talks about all of the festivals that we do as a South African Tamil tribe. But more crucially, she's put down recipes for every dish.
I was going to say more crucially
on the appropriate occasions. Yes.
Yeah.
And I look at it, and this is a recipe for cardiac arrest, basically.
That's great. It's wonderful. But I mean, makes for good dinners.
It does indeed,
and good
yes.
everything else.
Basically, sugar and it's more carbs and all of the good stuff.
That's awesome. Otherwise, what's happening? What have you noticed in the world?
The interesting thing is that the CEO of J.P. Morgan Chase has been calling Bitcoin a scam. And,
which is hilarious because JP Morgan Chase actually has their own Bitcoin crypto division.
Well, yes, they are substantially invested in terms of the BlackRock Bitcoin ETF, which is kind of
but even prior to
a fascinating situation.
JP, Citibank, in fact, all the big banks, they all have crypto divisions. They have people. I actually know someone who's employed at one of them and very senior there, and. Yeah, this has been for a while, 3-4 years at least, because they all realized that it wasn't going to go anywhere. If it's one of those sort of first they mock you, laugh at you, and then eventually they kind of join you.
Yes, they missed the Overton window, in other words.
Yes. Well, look, Bitcoin's interesting. Crypto's interesting. Obviously, we've discussed this before. So I don't want to get too deep into the weeds. It's probably not as interesting for everyone. But the point is that all these banks are very much invested, both in terms of resources that they've put forward towards dealing with crypto and allowing their investors to have access to that market. But also personally invested as banks. You mentioned the BlackRock stuff, but even before that, Goldman Sachs, I think, was buying a whole bunch of Bitcoin and Ethereum a couple of years back. So they've actually put investors' money into this stuff. So it's interesting that he thinks it's a scam. Why is he saying that?
Well, clearly he wants to drive down the price and then buy more. That would be my take on it.
Yeah, that sounds about right. Your camera looks very blue. Is that? Sorry, I'm just asking our tech in the studio here. Tips. Is that? It's going to be fine. Yeah, all right, cool.
Cameras are racist. You're fully aware of this. Because,
of course, cameras are racist.
Because,
tell us more.
Yeah, the light sensitivity gets picked up by, based on how light the objects are in the camera view. And, considering that I'm significantly darker than this wall behind me, whereas you have black panels behind you. And
I think also there's a white balance issue going on, which of course is racist, but I think that's what's happening with that camera. It's hasn't been given a good white balance. So those watching on YouTube, Kanthan's going to be blue for the next hour or so. It is what it is. It's a live recording, and we've started it, and we don't edit, so that's what it is. Let's talk a little bit about what's happening in the States on campus and university campuses. I know this guy who went to Princeton.
Mark Oppenheimer, good guy.
Yeah, and this other guy sitting in the studio with me right now, and they're part of it. Seems to have started a lot at Columbia, but has now spread obviously through all the Ivy Leagues. Princeton seems to be included in it. I see there were more than 50 academics who sort of signed up in support of the protesters at Columbia, who were actually removed at one point from campus.
Well, the campus is now in fact shut down at Columbia, and they've switched over to online learning only for the foreseeable future, just simply because it's impossible to conduct classes. So, and I think that that's going to be the go-to response in terms of dealing with any of this type of stuff.
It's interesting. So I have a little bit of insight here, because I actually was quite involved with the WITS during the time where Fees Must Fall started to occur. And, obviously Cape Town had Roads Must Fall, which then morphed into Fees Must Fall. And I think you could make the argument that Wits was the most affected by the Fees Must Fall situation in terms of the amount of shutdown that happened, the amount of violence on campus. I mean, the entire Great Hall, sort of the facade and all the windows and everything was essentially completely destroyed by students stoning the building. And there was something very interesting that happened around that time, which is that the Vice Chancellor was Adam Habib, who's gone very quiet, you'll notice, of late. But he was the Vice Chancellor.
Well, he no longer lives in this country.
He does, yeah. I know. He for years wrote pro-communist pieces for the newspapers, and then fled to London. But the point is that he was obviously very left, and his view on protests was obviously, especially certain protests he liked. So, that type of protest, fees must fall, of course, fees must fall. University must be free. It doesn't matter who pays for it, someone else. And he was always pro that stuff, very, very staunch sort of ANC guy. And then what happened was those protests happened. And I don't know if you remember, but he was kept hostage. He'll deny it, but he was kidnapped essentially by the protesters. So what happened was they had a sit-in.
Well, it's not dissimilar to what went down at Google.
Yeah, but Google just called the police and arrested the people, and that was the end of that, right? So because we don't have...
And then they fired all of those people.
Yes, and they fired all of them.
26 people were fired.
Yeah. So we must get on to that, because it's interesting that happened at a place like Google in Silicon Valley, because you wouldn't, if you had given me that scenario before that had happened and said what's going to occur here, I would have said something very different. But let me finish on the VIT story. So because we don't have public order policing anymore we have them in name, but we don't have them since Marikana, because they're all terrified that someone in the media will say something bad about them. Mobs can do whatever they want in South Africa. So what happened was Habib goes down to the floor of what's called Senate House, which they wanted renamed to a struggle hero. And he goes down to negotiate with these people, thinking he can negotiate in good faith with 19-year-old terrorists. And turns out he couldn't. And so instead of negotiating with them, they told him he needed to sit down on the floor. This is a 55-year-old man of very high sort of standing in society. He must sit down on the floor with them. And they basically kept him kidnapped for, I think, 6 to 8 hours, something like that. Kind of fed him a piece of bread here and there, and literally that was kind of what happened. I don't remember the exact details, but this has been well documented. Anyway, I saw a distinct change in him after that, which is that he became almost a security authoritarian, and it is very difficult. It would be very difficult. Because what happened around that time was actually that there were external forces coming into Wits, and they were going to the residences at night. So it was students of the university, but also people who had been bussed in from various political parties and just troublemakers. And they would plan, like military planning, what they were going to do the next day. Oh, we're going to go here and we're going to take rocks from there and we're going to throw them here. And if the police come there, we're going to move to this side and so on and so forth. And since then, under his guidance, before he left as the vice chancellor, he made that campus incredibly safe. So you can't just access it. You used to be able to just kind of get in. It didn't matter who you were. Now it all works on sort of biometrics, and you it's one person at a time.
Very much so. You have to check in and check out everywhere, and that's the case for UJ as well.
Yeah, and if you've just checked in. Mm-hmm. You can't check out and check back in. There's like time delays, and there's all this quite advanced technology and security that happens. And so since then, they're actually, while there have been protests, because the job of the SRC is essentially to cause shit every year, while there have been those protests, remember the head of the SRC just wants to become a member of parliament. That's their ultimate goal. They're not.
Who is the current head of the SRC?
I don't know, and I could care absolutely less. And because I'm no longer involved with the university, I can say these things. But the point is that lots of people have come along through that position and have caused trouble. And the more trouble you cause, obviously, the more headlines you get. The more headlines you get a bit more street cred within the political movements, and then ultimately you move along. Floyd Shivambu is a great example. Floyd Shivambu was involved in mass protests in the early 2010s.
Isn't he meant to be our next Minister of Finance?
Or late 2000s. I don't know what he's going to be, but the point is the guy was involved in a protest and led a protest that burnt down part of the law library. And just so I have legal protection there. I'm not saying Floyd Shivambu burnt anything down. I'm saying there was a protest which he was involved in, and part of what happened in that protest was that. So but that gets lots of headlines and lots of media attention, and so that kind of guy got sort of pushed forward into the spotlight, and I think part of why he ended up where he ended up was definitely as a result of his role there. Now, so Adam Habib became very much different. He's before, in fact, when he pitched to be the VC. You're saying
this was his come to Jesus moment.
It was kind of, because when he pitched to be VC, he had this very the Wits campus must be cosmopolitan and everyone must be able to go anywhere and we must be open to the whole society and all this horseshit. And ultimately, obviously, that completely changed. And essentially, that campus you can access if you are a student in good standing, and if you're not, tough luck. And so even the stuff around people who complain about fees becomes almost a moot point, because only the people who pay fees can actually demonstrate on campus in support of the people who don't pay fees. You can't get onto the campus anymore if you're not paying. So that I found that interesting, and I think that might happen at these other universities. Columbia may have to turn around and go, okay, we're going to have to limit access to campus so that we can prevent some of the stuff from happening. Because
well, like I said, that's already happened at Columbia. They've
gone to online, but online is not a university. It's the same as when we did online schooling during COVID. It's not school. I know there are people who now do it as homeschooling through online learning. I know that can happen, but essentially it's not the same as school. So,
Jonathan, again, you are falling for the trap of actually believing that the way in which we should be going to school is exactly the way we've been doing for the past few hundred years, which was basically started on the basis of a German military system, which required that you go to school during specific hours. You started off by standing in line, you learned how to march, and then you sat down at your desk and you went through processes. I'm of a view that, give it probably a couple of decades from now, and this entire process of learning is going to be entirely obsolete. And the reason for that is that we have disproportionate learning that takes place. No. Just let me work through this.
Yeah, okay,
because
cool.
You've had like a 20-minute stream of consciousness run. Adam Habib. Now, be schooled for the next couple of minutes. So basically, consider that when we go to school, we learn at different levels depending on what subject we are learning. So some of us are intuitively good at maths, others of us are intuitively good at more creative stuff like art. Some of us are incredibly good at languages. And yet what happens is when we go to school, we are all chronologically slotted into exactly the same category. So, a kid sitting in class is having difficulty with maths, very good in terms of languages, or vice versa. But they're all expected to learn at the same level chronologically over the period of 12 years before they go to university, where it all ends up getting repeated. Whereas what's going to be happening now on the basis of what the advances that are being made in large language models, and remember, we're talking large language models, not artificial intelligence, you're able to have guided instruction on a per-student basis that is going to be tailored very specifically to that particular student. And at that point, we're going to have a seismic shift. The seismic shift has to be this. You still need to go to school for the very simple reason that as human beings, we need to socialize. And we need to learn how to engage with other human beings. And that's a lifelong process. I still have difficulty with most human beings. And, I'm sitting here in my 60s. But we need to go through that process. And that, to my mind, becomes the reason why we go to school together. But the learning process is going to be decoupled from that. It's going to be on the basis of you are going to be learning very specific stuff tailored to exactly your level of competence. And the lessons are going to be steered in that direction. You remember the story of Khan Academy, by the way?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the interesting thing about Khan Academy was Salman Khan, who founded the thing, lived in Mumbai, used to go across to California, where his nephews were falling behind in terms of maths because, Indians teach maths properly and the Americans work on the assumption that you dumb it down to the lowest level. So he started to give lessons to his nephews. And so while he was there, and there was, immediately an uptick in terms of the level of knowledge and understanding that his nephews had. So he then goes back to Mumbai, and then his nephews call him and they say, listen, Uncle Salman, we're having difficulty again. How about you send us some lessons? So he recorded lessons on VHS tapes and sent them across to him. Now, the interesting thing was that when he went back to visit California again the following year, and he was giving live lessons to the two, and after a week, they came back to him and they said, Uncle Salman, we actually prefer the videos. And he said, why? They said, well, if I don't understand something, I can quickly rewind and I can listen to it again so that I can get my head around it. And that was kind of a Kodak moment for me. Shout out to everyone who doesn't know what's a Kodak moment. But that was a Kodak moment for me because it made me realize that the way in which we go about learning stuff in class is really tailored to that. It's almost like live TV versus streaming. Streaming, exactly the thing is you can very quickly rewind, go through a point again and catch up with it. So take the view that universities, and this comes back to...
I don't want to take the view. I'm going to argue your view, but carry on.
But universities, to my mind, in the way that we know and love, are going to be increasingly obsolete. They're going to be very specific disciplines that actually require you to be on the scene and working with hands-on instruction. And, if you had gone to medical school, you would have discovered this. instead
if
only instead of becoming an acclaimed journalist. So medical schools, for example, are going to be a very specific example of where you actually need to be there. Clearly working in a chemistry lab, or and not everyone can have a Large Hadron Collider at home, but you understand where I'm coming from.
Yeah, I do. My problem with this whole argument, it's been going on a long time. So this is sort of a standard. Now it would almost be a TikTok or TikTok or Instagram sort of clip where someone goes, "Did you know that school is only 200 years old or 150 years old, and it came from German design, and then it was really optimized in the United States for the Industrial Revolution because they wanted little workers, and the school bell is the same bell that was used in factories, and that kind of thing, right? And so that's why the desks are all lined up in a row, and that's why the bell sounds like it does, and that's why things are divided into 45 minutes or 30-minute sections, and it's all sort of to mimic factory work, essentially, in some respects, in terms of shifts and rotations and all that stuff. Fine. I mean, I historically, that's accurate. The thing is I worry when there's this let's throw the baby out with the bathwater type of attitude. School works for many reasons. Firstly, let's start by saying that school is not only for education of children, it's for time consumption of children. Okay, kids have to do something during the day.
Yes, they should play.
Yeah, well, that's fine. They can play, and some schools have that. And so this is the point I'm going to make, which is that there are very few schools that are completely now. I am talking globally. I know that you're going to take me to some rural school in the Eastern Cape, and they'll still have the desks lined up in a row, and classes will still be 30 minutes, and there's no hybrid teaching and all the rest of that stuff. But I'm talking about the move of where schools is going to, is that, and I'll get to universities as well, but is that they have moved a lot away from the idea that everything's so rigid and fixed. So schools do have a lot of play now. I'm talking about play in terms of where they go. Some schools actually for younger kids certainly have more play, actual time for play. And so I think there's an evolution of education that's happening, and I agree with you that to some point it may very well change from the traditional. I'm not sure it will change from you take your kids to a specific place in the morning, because I mean, I don't buy into any of the sort of internet age what's the revolution they're now talking about? The fourth industrial revolution bullshit.
Cultural revolution.
Yeah, no, the fourth industrial revolution, where the idea would be school is not going to be at a place because you'll just have VR goggles, right? And then you'll log on to school in the morning in your bedroom or in your kitchen or whatever. I don't buy any of that. I think social interaction matters. I do think there are important aspects to school in terms of kids being able to socialize with each other. I know that's always been the criticism of homeschooling, and I'm not particularly critical of that.
You do realize that I started this conversation by saying that kids will need to go to school in order to socialize.
Yeah.
So now you are going down an entirely different tangent.
Okay, so let me go back. Let me move away from the socialization. Schools are hybrid now, for example. So the idea, for example, the Khan idea, many schools will have the option to
You are confusing hybridization with guided learning. So hybridization means that your teacher is still sitting in front of a camera and is talking to an audience, which is generally on Zoom or Microsoft Teams. And that is not guided instruction. It's an entirely different business model. Guided instruction means that you could have two kids, potentially from the same school, at the same age. One is learning maths at a level that is 2 grades higher than most kids are in that class. Another is learning maths at a level that is 1 grade lower than people in that class, because of the fact that you have guided instruction that allows people to progress at a faster rate. The instruction models themselves become gamified so that you're doing things like you're swapping questions around. then feed different questions based on the type of answers that you get originally. So I've been doing this, for example, I've been doing an online maths of finance class through Yale, which does that pretty much. And it's a free class, which is the fascinating thing. I just log in, do like about an hour a day and go through the process. And it very quickly, it learns from the way in which you are learning. And so there are a number of things that come as a result of this. The one is that there becomes no need for the concept of fees must fall, because ultimately the cost of building these educational models is going to be paying the teachers who are designing the models. And then it becomes a once-off cost, which means that we are not far from the stage in our existence where education, by and large, becomes essentially free. Not only does it become free, it also means that you actually can't be cheating on it because of the fact that you have to go through the entire process. And unless you're going to be paying someone who is, potentially sitting in a shack in Mumbai with an internet connection to be learning on your behalf so that you can fake a qualification, there's probably going to be a handful of people who will still do that type of stuff. But in as little as 10 years' time, we'll be looking at the way in which we go about learning and the way in which we go about teaching, and it's going to be entirely different.
I think some of it will change. I certainly do. With the hybridization, what I was talking about is that you talked about rewinding a tape, and so that is happening at schools and universities.
But it's not the same as guided instruction, and that's the game changer.
So guided instruction, this is I'm going to use your 80-20 rule on you that you like so much. The reality, and it's more like 95-5 actually. The reality is that actually it turns out most 7-year-olds learn the same stuff at the same pace and have the same receptive ability. And then 5% of them will be above, and probably 5% of them will be below.
So my facts are going to disagree with your feelings, because as a very specific example, okay, you compare the mathematical ability of the average Russian high school kid with the mathematical ability of the average American high school kid. Now, either you're going to take the view that that's genetics,
yes,
that the Russians are better.
I am.
Okay, all right. Well, in which case I'd be inclined to agree with you.
Okay.
Because, certainly in terms of the...
I think there's a reason Asians are so good at maths. Turns out, I think that's genetic. I really do.
No, but I'm talking about the Russians in this case.
Sure.
Yeah.
Great. I like the Russians and the Americans because it's both white, so we can't get into trouble.
Well, remember that Hitler didn't think that the Russians were white. He thought that they were,
Well, he didn't think they were Aryan.
Yes, there were Slavs who needed to be exterminated because Lebensraum, and But anyway, to get back to the point.
Yes.
Okay, we know already that if you happen to be a kid who gets bedtime stories read to them, and I think that that's something that I do consistently. I read bedtime stories to my kid. Done that with my two elder ones. I stopped with my middle child when she hit 14.
I was just going to ask, when do you stop? 26? So.
No. I stopped at 14, and we went through the entire Count of Monte Cristo.
Okay.
Yes, but and currently with my 8-year-old, that's kind of a daily routine. Currently going through Beatrix Potter's Fairy Caravan. Mm-hmm. Which is actually an incredibly dark story, I must tell you. But but we'll park that. But the fact of the matter is that I end up with a situation where my kids have a reading ability that is, streets ahead of the rest of the classes. So, and the difficulty that I had with my middle child when she was 9 years old, and they assessed her, and she had the reading level of a 16-year-old. So what I'm saying is that a lot of this stuff has got nothing to do with that fact that everyone learns at the same time. We learn different subjects at different levels based on, to a large extent, the interest that we have in how cool that particular thing sounds. So when I really got into chemistry, for example.
Okay, so I want to throw a spanner in the works because that all may be true, and your vision of the future, where the guy in Mumbai is going to learn the same pace at the guy, or faster pace in the guy in New York, and and he's going to say, I went to ABC online school, and the guy in New York's going to go, I went to some fancy school, and everyone's going to go, nobody cares what school you went to. None of that's going to happen, because it's what the purpose is. Okay, so, and we go back to the history. So the purpose originally, which the reason why everyone wants to dump generic schooling, is it was for factory workers, and we're making drones, and we don't work in factories that much anymore, and we're trying to build people towards a services economy, or whatever we're trying to teach them towards, and that's the whole point. It's what's the purpose, what we're trying to get out. And so if, for example, we did UBI, and everyone was going to grow up, and once you were 18, there was going to be $5,000 in your account every month. It wouldn't really matter what you learned. We could go, hey, do you like geography? And you could go, no, I don't really like geography. We go, okay, don't learn it. No problem. Or you can learn it to this very sort of small scale level. What do you like? You like maths? Yeah, I like maths. Okay, go for it. Go Stephen Hawking level maths. That's great. But the world doesn't work that way. So if you want
currently.
A restructure, yeah, sure.
Currently.
But if you want a restructuring of education, you need an entire restructuring of the world. That's not a simple thing that happens over 10 years. I'm not even convinced it's something that necessarily happens because, and this is the other part of it, there's a power structure that exists. And this is the real problem with Ivy Leagues, for example. So, there are better places to study medicine, for example, or law than any of the Ivy Leagues. But that's not the point, right? If you study law at Harvard, then you are going to get a top job in a top firm, or you're going to end up as a judge on one of the circuit courts, or you can maybe even end up in the Supreme Court, right? That's your career track. And the only reason is because you have Harvard behind your name. The entire world exists like this on every level for everything. And the reality is that I think that that's baked into human nature.
So let me immediately upend that
yes,
historical perspective. So let's use Yale Law School as a very particular example.
Yeah.
Okay, where you've now had judges in the U.S. Justice system turning around and saying, we are not going to take any clerks who have gone through Yale Law School. Okay, as a very specific example, that has immediately, so, you're talking in terms of the Overton window shifting.
This is a pressure narrative.
You're talking about the Overton window shifting around a particular belief that you hold dear, that Yale Law School historically was the primary
I don't
feeder.
hold this dear at all.
Okay, well, yes, but you are saying that it can't be changed. I'm saying that, yes, it can be changed, yes, it is being changed, and yes, the change is unstoppable. And that we are not going to see a revision.
So here's what I think the change
reversion
is.
To business as usual.
Here's the change you can have. You can have a change whereby something that was once prestigious is no longer considered to be prestigious, and therefore the value that it holds disappears over time, and eventually nobody cares about that name recognition. You can have that.
That's a great point that you're currently making, and it's very apposite in terms of something that I shared just a couple of minutes before we started.
Yeah.
We started this.
Let me finish.
But carry on with your thought process.
So you can that can occur,
Yes.
and that occurs over time. Monarchs are a good example. So there are monarchs across the world that no longer exist, that were at one point very powerful, very prestigious, very recognized. If you were a member of that monarchy, you were able to open doors very easily globally. And they no longer exist. And so you could walk into somewhere right now and go, I'm from the French monarchy, and nobody would give a shit. It wouldn't matter. However, power structures are not dissolved and then a vacuum exists. That's not how anything works. Nature abhors a vacuum, so does human society. Okay? And so what happens is you can get rid of Yale and Harvard and Yale is just going to destroy itself by doing what it's doing. So by those judges are turning around and going, basically privileged people go to Yale. Therefore, we are not going to take Yale people anymore because that's you can only get into Yale if you're privileged, and therefore we're going to take other people, and therefore we're going to uplift society in that way. Now, that may or may not be true. The universities will destroy themselves because they've stopped doing LSATs and SATs and SATs and all the rest of it. And so the quality of people going to a lot of universities is going to drop. And so the output over time will drop. And so the prestige will drop. But the prestige, something will replace it. Now, maybe it's what you're talking about. And that may very well be true. But even within that, there will be, I did the Kanthan School of Guided Learning, right? And they'll be like, ooh, the Kanthan School of Global. That'll always happen because the reality is that why are there brands, for example? Why do people want to wear certain types of brands and not just basic clothing? Why do they want to do that? It's because we always go towards what we think. I'm not saying those brands are excellent, but we go towards excellence.
You're not wearing branded clothing.
No.
Neither am I.
Yeah.
Now, increasingly, you're going to find a scenario where more and more people get aware of the essential idiocy of being brand conscious, and it is essential idiocy. You are going to have that shift happening, and I am seeing to a large extent it is already happening, just simply based on conversations that happen in social media around how people make financial decisions around their lives. The very specific thing around the type of car that you drive, for example. The simple realization that at the point at which you buy a car brand new, you drive it off the showroom floor, and you turn around and come back to the same dealer, and you've immediately lost.
5 minutes later.
40% of the value is immediately just wiped out on the basis of that. This morning, I shared a tweet from Gerald Ratner. You might remember.
Can I interject slightly there, just quickly, just on the car thing? You are correct, but if you were to buy a limited edition Bentley, and drove it off the floor, you'd be able to drive it back and sell it for more. So, which leads to my point, which is that there will always be prestige. But carry on. This morning,
person who buys a limited edition Bentley is not the type of person who sells a limited edition Bentley.
Perhaps. I mean, some people do pre-orders on certain types of cars to be able to sell them. This is just business stuff that goes on all the time.
Yes.
You know, Ferrari's releasing a new model that's going to take 3 years to get hold of. You put your name early on the list. You buy the car for the exorbitant price that it costs, but there's rich people who want to get the car and not wait 3 years, and now you can obviously mark up 40% on what you paid for it, for example.
I don't know any of those rich people, but so Gerald Ratner,
yes,
okay, who was the Ratner Group CEO, and he managed to, in a single speech, wipe 500 million pounds of the value of his company. And I'm actually going to share this thing. Let's see if I can play it.
Yeah.
Good afternoon, Mr. President, Royal Highness, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you, Mr. President, for asking me to address such a prestigious audience. Also in Ratner's, we sell gifts as well as jewellery. Things like a teapot for £2. Or we've got this imitation book that you lay on your coffee table. Pages don't actually open, but they're beautiful curled up corners with imitation antique dust. I know you might say it's not in the best possible taste, but we sold 250,000 of them last year. We also do this nice sherry decanter. It's cut glass, and it comes complete with 6 glasses on a silver-plated tray that your butler could bring you in and serve you drinks on. And it's really only cost £4.95. People say to me, how can you sell this for such a low price? I say, because it's total crap. We even sell a pair of earrings for under £1. Gold earrings as well. And some people say, well, that's cheaper than a prawn sandwich from Marks and Spencer's. But I have to say, the sandwich will probably last longer than the earrings. But
Okay, so he detonated his career and company in a very short period of time.
But essentially what he was doing was exposing the inherent shallowness of branding and being brand conscious. Because from the point of view of the fabric that goes into the T-shirts that you and I are currently wearing, it's exactly the same type of fabric and the same type of industrial stitching that goes into a Hugo Boss T-shirt, except the Hugo Boss T-shirt ends up costing 10 orders of magnitude more than what I ended up paying for this particular T-shirt. And as you get people aware of the intrinsic value of things based on the fact that, remember that the opportunities to actually show off the type of car that you drive, again, falls away completely at the point at which you're not jostling for prime position in the office parking lot. And that entire social structure then ends up crumbling. Which is why I'm saying that these changes are happening a lot quicker.
So that was, but I just need to point something out. So that guy made that speech, which detonated his career. You can go read up about him.
His company, basically wiped.
The guy was a multi-millionaire.
He still is, probably,
and apparently not as wealthy as he. Put it this way, he was very much in with high society. He sort of was cruising around with all the sort of top people in London. This is 32 years ago that he made that speech.
Yes.
And he lost a lot, and he's not in with that group anymore, because also you're not really meant to.
Because
you're not really meant to show people behind the curtain.
Yes, exactly. Which is what he did, and in fact, he tweeted yesterday. 33 years ago today. It seems like yesterday, and I wish it was tomorrow. I would cancel it.
Yeah. So my point is 32 years, and I think, if anything, people have become more brand conscious and more focused on these things. You're pointing to some things that have become less popular, like cars, for example. And the reason cars have become less of a thing is because there's an entire generation that's not really interested in driving anymore, and they don't prioritize vehicles as previous generations did. And there's a lot to that. There's a hell of a lot to that. I mean, part of it's got to do with the fact that the generation in the 50s and 60s, the car was the statement of the family. It was like, you bought a car to show people you were doing well. It was also very important. It was how you got your family around, which was in places where public transport wasn't this big thing that it is now. So that's another aspect to it. There's a whole lot to why cars are maybe not seen in the same way as they once were. You've also got this current generation, the sort of younger millennial generation, who value experience over asset, and they like to go traveling, for example, as against owning houses or cars or things like that. So I think there's a lot of that feeding into it. But at the same time, since he made that sort of speech, you've had that Kardashian chick become a billionaire from makeup, which is probably crap. It's not. I can't imagine she's a great chemist and she's come up with great makeup that's better than Revlon or L'Oreal or whatever. She just put her name on it and had a good social media following, and so she sold it. You've had the rise of plenty of brands and the re-rise of plenty of brands. So there's lots of sort of old school brands that have reinvented themselves and are now very sort of popular fashion brands, so to speak. And I feel like I see a lot more people wearing branded type clothing than I don't know than I used to. Maybe I wasn't noticing it, but I don't think there's been a decrease.
So let me then try and pull in a fundamental theme, which I think we should look at, which also actually then ties in with the entry point to this conversation, which was the way in which we're looking at universities very specifically. And it's the entire concept of return on investment.
Okay.
All right. So the issue for me right now in terms of universities, to a large extent, why I think they're obsolete, is the return on investment that goes from attending a university for the majority of people
Yes,
is a negative.
I agree.
So we currently have in our country 800,000 unemployed university graduates. Now, it's a terrible return on investment. Okay, you've spent, in most cases, people don't complete their degrees in the allotted time, so they end up spending a couple of more years on doing so.
Yeah.
And they eventually end up with a degree, and the degree is incapable of getting them to earn a living because they don't actually have real skills that go with it. And so, in fact, what ends up happening is there's this constant reinvestment of throwing bad money after worse money. And these people then end up getting basic income grants, and they're overall a burden on society. Whereas if you had a person who was learning very practical skills, so I don't know of any unemployed plumbers, to put this in perspective. I don't know of any unemployed electricians. And it comes down to the question of the return on investment that you get from spending a particular thing. I think that you're seeing a shift right now in terms of particularly people who are going through the stage now of completing high school, getting into university, who are looking at people in their circles who are not politically connected and looking at those who have actually managed to carve out a living for themselves in the absence of political connections. And right now, that's going to be the majority of people in that age bracket in our country, because the middle class in our country has been growing at a steady rate, but the growth has been coming from two levels. Either you're politically connected, in which case you end up being part of that feeding chain.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you need to end up coming up with something that's going to sustain you and sustain your family. And that generally ends up being in the terrain of starting your own business and then building something that's going to be sustainable. So the return on investment in terms of buying a university degree by going there and studying for 4 years and then ending up unemployed versus actually taking the same money, putting it into a business, growing it, I think people are becoming increasingly aware of that. And then you're going to end up seeing a shift in terms of how people assess other things. The crucial point, for example, in terms of cell phones. This is, so it's an iPhone, but it's an iPhone 8. It's about 5 generations back.
More.
Okay.
7 generations back, I think.
Yeah, okay, yeah, you're right, because we're now on an iPhone 15.
Yeah.
Why have I not replaced it?
It still works, I assume.
Yeah, exactly, it still works. So the fact of the matter is, there is no technological shift at a fundamental level that has taken place over the past 5 years.
Yeah.
Okay,
all
so
right.
now apply the same logic in terms of cars. Is there a fundamental difference between the cars that you are buying brand new today versus the cars that you bought 5 years ago? Now, they've all got the same level of connectivity. Okay, they've all got the same level of safety. They've all got the same levels of fuel efficiency. And so why would you be interested in replacing it at short notice when the money could be put to better use in other areas?
I think, sure. I mean, this is, we could debate this a lot because I think age affects this. So as you age, you start having a different perspective on material goods. I'm saying this anecdotally. I assume there's some research to this effect, because it seems pretty obvious to me that as you get older, people get older, they tend to be a bit smarter about their money. Old people, for example, change their cars a lot less often than younger people. But you know, so you say about this, but in South Africa, for example, we have a huge interest in brands and cars, and buying sort of the flashiest possible thing we can buy. People spend a fortune. People who are employed, the middle class, spend a fortune of their monthly salary on car repayments, for example. I'm not sure that that's necessarily reflected. Also, you've got an iPhone 8. Don't see a point to replace it. 10 years ago, I would have been like, why do you have an iPhone 8? Just get a new iPhone. Now I'm on your page. I actually have a relatively new iPhone, but the point is before that, I was 3 or 4 generations behind, and then it broke. So I replaced it. But I only replace it when it breaks. I don't really see a need to upgrade to the latest, greatest. That said, the sales numbers, while they've slowed a bit, they're still pretty good. Apple still does very well off its new iPhones. It still does pretty well
in the United States.
Africa is one of its largest expanding. It's the fastest growing locations. Now they do interesting things. This is perhaps a separate discussion. They do very interesting things in Africa. So there's an entire resale of iPhones that they don't do anywhere else in the world. They purposefully do that here because of the cost differences. So they know that on average, African populations aren't going to buy the latest iPhone for 30 to 40,000 rand or $1,500. But they do a lot of recycling on purpose, which they purposefully don't do anywhere else in the world because they want their new phone to be bought, right?
But you're talking about Apple. Apple themselves don't even have a presence in South Africa.
Yeah,
So
they don't.
Well, no, Apple doesn't give a shit about Africa. If you look in terms of the numbers that get churned out in iPhone sales, in iPhone sales in South Africa, and let's be very clear, South Africa is the biggest market for iPhones on the continent. Apple doesn't even have an official presence in this country. They've outsourced all of their stuff to the core group, who do a reasonably good job.
That's not entirely true. Apple doesn't have a physical presence in the country in the sense that they don't run their own stores and they don't run repairs and all that stuff. But Apple has very much got a presence in the country and across the whole of Africa through what actually makes them most of their money, which is the entire sort of back-end network of Apple. So when you get an Apple device and you get an iCloud and you then have to access the App Store and music and all of that stuff, that is very much accessible across the continent in the various currencies in the various countries, and that is very much useful to them, and that is a very fast-growing market for them. So they may have thought, well, the guys that are on the ground currently are doing a good enough job, and yes, the sales numbers aren't high enough for us to put our own people, our own resources, our own capital, because it's all going to be capex that they're going to have to spend here to accelerate themselves into a position of having a major presence. And they don't skimp. I mean, when they put in an Apple store, they spend a lot of money, but I don't think that they have no interest. And so, but getting back to the point, I mean, Apple is a nice example because I mean, there's both. I think they're both sides of the argument.
We used Apple, we used motor vehicles, and remember, I'm not just talking in because remember the starting point around this is that the difference in technology between my 7-year-old phone.
Yes.
And the phone that you get today, you'll have a better camera, you'll have a faster processor, you'll have a couple of more image processing effects that you'll end up using on it. But, for those of us who spend significant amount of time using our phones essentially as a communication device, which is for instant messaging, for receiving emails, occasional engagement on social media, there isn't a significant difference, which is, my point. When you have the stagnation in terms of technology, and then people suddenly realize, well, wait a second, if I'm going to be spending this much more money, what am I getting for it? And that's where the return on investment
this is the value argument. This is you saying universities are going to end because the value. And so for me, I'm saying to you, look, I don't necessarily. I do see the changes that would happen. I think that's maybe true. I also think there's a lot of self-sabotage happening in those universities. But the value from universities has come because 50 years ago, the number of degrees that you could get from a university could probably be counted on 2 hands, right? It wasn't broad. at every level, and I want to get into that because so firstly, you went to study law, you went to study medicine, you went to study accounting, finance. You went to study certain things that were very tangible, very fixed. You could say, what is the curriculum here? And it was obvious. Here you go. Here's the curriculum. This is what you're going to learn, bullet points. And these are the professors that are going to teach you. And the reason that they're going to teach you is because they've had 30 years of experience with this stuff, and so on and so forth. And so there's a clear value proposition there. When you start saying to people, well, you can come and do a degree in, the one we all like to mock, gender studies, right? Or feminine dance theory or something like that. When you say to people, you can do a degree in that, they start going, okay, and then what's the value? Or maybe even something that's real. Let's say African art. Okay, cool. You do a 3-year degree in African art. It's real, that exists. What value is that going to provide you? Okay, all right, I'm going to be the head of the museum down in Joburg that does all the African art. Okay, they only need one curator. There's 6 of you in the class, right? Every year for 10 years. There's 60 of you now. Are there 60 museums? No, it turns out not. All right. So this becomes a problem with the value proposition. And so universities are either going to learn that they have to be the best at offering things of actual value.
No, but they don't need to. And you see, the reason why they don't need to is because, and let's take the Ivy Leagues very specifically. Okay, and to a large extent, I'm complicit in this as well, because I still give money to Princeton because, I did get a free education from them. So, but the fact is that they actually don't need to charge fees because the endowment that these universities have is so huge. And the money that they end up spending comes from the earnings that they have on those endowments. They never touch the capital of those endowments. I mean, you're talking...
But Kanthan, there are hundreds, not even hundreds, there are thousands of universities in the world, okay? And... let's talk about something like you're talking about the guys in the top 20.
No. So remember, what you are talking about is trying to incentivize. You're trying to make an argument as to why universities will do a rational thing in terms of cutting back on degrees that are non-productive. And I'm saying to you that when you have access to unlimited funds, which is pretty much what they have.
No, but they don't. So there's
the Ivies,
guys in the top 20. Okay, the Ivies do.
But in order for the rats and mice universities, and when I say rats and mice universities, I'm talking about South African universities in that context.
Everybody else. It's not just South Africans.
So the South African universities, they're then going to have to, just in order to keep up with the fact that the Ivy Leagues offer gender studies, they're going to need to do exactly the same thing, just in order to pretend that there's a level of competence that goes with this particular university. Meanwhile, the Chinese don't give a shit about doing the gender studies things.
So why don't they need to keep up? If they're making the argument the South African universities do it just to keep up.
Because if you look in terms of academic papers in the sciences that are currently being published, the Chinese are currently outgunning the West. Okay, and so in terms of now, listen, you might be scoffing about this because of your prejudice against the Chinese.
I damn straight I'm scoffing because I'll tell you right now, quantity in science is not quality.
Yeah, I disagree with that as well. Okay, because
why?
Because if you work on the assumption again, applying the Pareto principle, which I'm very fond of.
Yeah.
Okay. If you assume that 20% of what is being produced, 20% of what the Chinese are producing is higher than 20% of what the West is producing, and simply on that basis. So let's.
It doesn't apply. But I'm going to tell you from someone who actually reads the science. Actually reads the science.
You and I can.
The stuff that comes out of China is almost always low end stuff. Often very poorly done.
And again, yes, it's 80,
not all of it.
It's 80% of the stuff that's that category.
It's not a Pareto principle.
And I'm saying it is a Pareto principle. And I will tell you very simply, why is it that the Chinese have hypersonics and the Americans don't?
I can tell you it's got nothing to do with their university output.
So who are the physicists who actually came up with it? Who are the engineers who actually built it?
The reality is why a country, we're going to get into military stuff again, but why a country has military stuff has nothing to do with the university output. Absolutely nothing. Einstein was not a university genius. Sorry.
You do understand, though, that the fundamental...
The Americans had to take Germans to come up with half their shit. I mean, the reality
you
still
needed Enrico Fermi to be coming up with the concept to start off with, right?
Yeah. So
and that was an entirely academic premise. So, we could go back and forth around this. So let's park for a second the idea that you think that the Americans, in terms of the sciences, are ahead of the Chinese and ahead of the Indians.
I would say the West is ahead of them.
And ahead of the Russians. So I will park that.
I didn't say the Russians.
Okay.
And I didn't say the Indians either.
So
I said the Chinese. The Chinese cheat, okay? This is the Chinese. Chinese society is the entire Chinese system. Let me maybe rant on this for a second.
Why was the president of Harvard fired?
Because she plagiarized.
Thank you. And what's the technical? That's a technical term. In other words, she cheated.
Yeah, all right. That's an individual cheat, and I'm talking about an entire society which cheats. Okay, so the problem is, and we're gonna have to learn this the hard way.
No, but we can't spend time talking about your prejudice against the Chinese. We are discussing the principles.
Not my prejudice, the facts and the reality. The Chinese are an entire society built on cheating. The entire thing is built on cheating. I won't say this about anyone else. I don't believe this about India. I don't believe this about Russia. I don't believe this about anyone not in the West. But I do most certainly, and I don't believe this about the other Asian nations either.
How many times have you traveled to China?
I believe this about. It doesn't matter how many times I've traveled to China. I can tell you this about China. When China wants to build something, they reverse engineer it. They don't build it themselves. They steal. Okay, when China wants to make a car that looks like that is what a G-Wagon would be, they don't make their own G-Wagon like Ineos went with Grenadier and made like a Defender. They don't do that. They take a G-Wagon and then they copy it identically. Go look at all of the stuff, and for some reason, copyright law doesn't apply to the Chinese. They can steal whatever they want because everyone's scared of them. So what should be happening is that every time China does that, there should be sanctions on them. All right? China steals everything. They're not brilliant. They're not a creative society. China exists solely, and this will end at some point, and then they're going to be in real trouble. China exists today the way it is. I'm not saying as a country.
I've been hearing this particular narrative about China for the past couple of decades.
Solely because they produce. That's why. They don't create, they produce. It's the reason why that iPhone of yours and mine and everyone else who's got one, it's the reason why it says designed in California. Okay? It's because China has had 20 years to copy and recreate an iPhone, and they've tried. Certainly, many times. Xiaomi has tried really hard, and they still cannot hit the mark. They still can't do it. And that's got to do with creativity. When you stop stealing and you stop cheating and you sit back and you go, right, we are going to create ourselves. We're not going to copy. Then you create brilliance. And China has yet to create brilliance. And that's China's problem.
Using Xiaomi as a case in point, I shared last week the latest EV that has been produced by Xiaomi.
Yeah, I saw their shitty
car.
I think their car's shitty, as I do think Tesla's car's shitty. But yeah, look, let's. So the bottom line is this: we have disagreements.
I think you're obsessed around China, and my argument is not about China.
My argument is universities are going the way of the dodo.
My argument is that increasingly, the stuff that we are seeing that is emerging in very specific fields, let's be very clear about that.
Yeah.
The strength of the U.S., and I have to say this very clearly, comes from the fact that historically it has been the place where you could launch a startup and take it through an incubation period and turn it into a unicorn. And that has been for the longest time where innovation has come from in the modern world.
Yeah.
All right. So if you look in terms of where all of the big growth has come in terms of tech, and I've had this argument with Mamokgethi Phakeng when she was sitting in the studios around the corner here, where I was telling her that I thought that universities are obsolete, using very specific examples around the likes of Zuckerberg, around the likes of Microsoft, Steve Jobs himself. They were all people who were not part of the formal education structure. But
Yeah,
they are the people.
I mean,
they're the people who
proving my
actually ended up
point.
innovating. And the US has been able to hold that technological lead for the longest time simply because it was always possible for those startups to get onto the scene and to be able to innovate at a dizzy rate. What has happened over the past period, and we're talking over the past 10 years, is that the ability for people to launch businesses in the US that are able to do that has been completely ripped out from under them. So it's at a couple of levels. The first level is that you have people who come up with ideas, they file a patent around it, which then gets bought out by one of the big guns, who then shelve it for a 20-year period, because that ends up guaranteeing them market stability for the 20-year period.
Sure.
Yes. So that's the first point. The second point now that is really hitting US startups in the groin is that in 2017, there were amendments to the tax law that took place. This was under Trump, by the way. Okay, and the amendments to the tax law were that you could no longer write off your R&D as a tax expense in the current fiscal year. So here's the situation. You launch a startup. Okay, the startup starts generating product. You're making revenue from that product, but you take all of the revenue from the product and you pour it into R&D to make the product even bigger and better. Okay, and you could write off that entire cost that you're pouring back into retooling, into hiring more staff. Wait. Let me get to the point around this.
Sure.
Okay, so now this tax code that was rewritten in 2017, which was basically part of Trump's entire tax cut package at the time, okay, gave a window at the end of which the startups are no longer allowed to write off their current R&D expenditure. They then have to write that off over a period of 5 years. So what does that mean? Okay, I've invested 100 million US in terms of starting up my company. In my first year, I get 5 million of revenue from the first launch of my product. I'm only able to take 20% of that and allocate it to my R&D expenditure. I'm now forced to pay tax on the outstanding $4 million.
We got you.
Yeah. So you're completely hosed. So the only area where the US, to my mind, has had superiority up until now, because you and I are both fully aware of the fact that in China, your ability to develop that type of creativity from scratch doesn't exist because the nature of communism.
Yes.
Okay.
Chinese Communist Party.
Yes. Yeah. So the only area where the US actually had the advantage was in terms of the startup culture. They've ripped out the rug from under that. And so one of two things is going to happen. Either you're going to have a very quick, drastic rewrite of those tax laws, because already you're going to see a situation where startups are just going to go under because they can't afford that reinvestment cycle anymore.
Okay, but can I challenge you for a second? The heyday of the United States was not the last 20 years, which is startup culture. The heyday of the United States was the 100 years preceding that, and probably about 60 years preceding that.
So what are they bringing to the world today then?
So I'm just going to say this. I don't know too much detail about the tax law you're talking about, but I will just say that I'm pretty sure that all of the R&D wasn't being written off. At some point that got written into the tax law. Now Trump, you say, wrote it out of the tax law, right? Tax law is perversion as far as I'm concerned. It's all theft. But when you go down this road, you're going to have humans trying to manipulate, because the truth be told is the difference between us and the mammals or the rest of all the animals This is what separates us from the beasts. What really separates us from the beasts is not our intelligence in and of itself. It's not our language abilities. It's not any of those things. What really separates us is that as a species, we can subvert any system. Sometimes it takes us a bit of time, but that is what separates us. As humans, we can subvert any system. So when we invent a system, and this is what lawmakers do, lawmakers go, here's a problem.
I just want to point out at this. I want to point out at this point, though,
Yeah.
that I'm talking about Overton window stuff.
Yeah.
You're talking about something that has existed since the dawn of humanity. And I'm talking about the Overton window shifting very specifically around U.S. innovation and the single point.
I'm going to tell you why it's not outside of the Overton window. That's what I'm trying to get to, which is, so we subvert anything. So you bring in a law that says, so why does Trump take that out? And it wasn't Trump, it was whoever wrote those documents. But the point is, and I think it was Paul Ryan, actually. But the point is why does it come out? Well, probably because at some point, the R&D thing sounds like a 90s, early 2000s thing. At some point, they were like, oh, let's give a tax break for R&D, because if people are doing R&D, it does what Kanthan says. It encourages startups. It encourages people to pour money into research and development, which means we become the innovation hub of the world. That sounds very logical. And 10 years in, some smart accountants go, oh, geez, check, we can put anything we like into the R&D side of things. And then we can write it off to tax. And a company goes, what does that mean? And they go, well, you could just say that 90% of your company's R&D. Give everyone R&D titles, and then their salaries.
You see the difference between what you are saying and what I am saying.
So they subverted the system.
No. So the difference between what you are saying and what I am saying is that you are basing yours on hypothetical conjecture, and I'm telling you what's actually happening. Because the categories in terms of what counts in terms of R&D is very specific. So I'll tell you the two areas in which they are very specific. It's in terms of reinvestment in terms of your technology, which means that you're buying actual computers, as an example, or you upscaling on the number of virtual machines that you're buying in the cloud, which is where an increasing amount of your expenditure goes to. And it's in terms of people. So
people can be manipulated.
No. There are very specific categories around this. And up until now, those have been, again, very carefully managed. So if you are hiring people to do coding for a very specific piece of
nobody's
technology.
Auditing that, Kanthan.
No, actually, it does get audited because the IRS is actually better than anyone at this point.
The IRS are just as moronic as every other tax
No, so you
agency.
want to talk conspiracy theories.
I'm not talking conspiracy theories. I'm talking about how things work with tax.
So the starting point around this conversation, let me just pull us back on track. Okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Firstly, I've said to you that currently academics in China are producing a better quality of research overall compared to the Western world.
And I've said to you that
which you should doubt, not on the basis of evidence, but on the basis
I'll give you evidence. I'll bring you evidence. I'll bring you the last 20 papers
let's
published on ophthalmology from China and America.
So let's park that let's park that conversation.
Yeah.
We then moved on to my saying that the area where the United States has excelled up until now
is innovation.
Has been innovation based on the fact that it was up until...
And General Electric did it through the entire 20th century without tax breaks. But anyway, carry on.
Up until now, the ability of small businesses to start off and take a product, an idea through from product development to mass production to actually successful market...
Has been helped by a tax break.
Has been made possible based on the fact that you didn't actually have profitability coming from those companies. So right now, I've invested 100 million, like I've said. I brought in 5 million of revenue in the first year. You're taxing that revenue as opposed to actually allowing for the fact that the underlying cost structure means that this is not yet in a state of profitability.
I get you on the whole tax thing. I get you. But the examples you've brought up, Steve Jobs, Mark Zuckerberg, none of them had this tax break.
No, they did.
Steve Jobs did not have this tax break. In his garage in the 70s, Steve Jobs did not have this tax break. Apple did not innovate through this tax break on R&D.
John, you see,
He didn't, though.
No, you're using spurious logic because remember at that point they were not actually putting out a product.
With Steve Jobs did put up a product.
At that point, when they were innovating from their garage, they were not putting out a product at that point.
Put out a product within about 5 years of that.
Yeah. 5 years later,
Well,
and
R&D?
at the point at which they hit profitability, they began paying taxes.
Well, they probably didn't, but anyway.
No, actually, So take the view as well. Jeff Bezos also started in exactly the same way in his garage. My point is that when Steve Jobs and Wozniak have started off and they're buying chips and they're investing into this thing and they haven't yet started selling an actual product.
Yeah, I've got you. I've got you.
Yeah.
You and I. This is the bottom line. You say there's a tax that made all innovation possible for startups in I don't know what period. It's not certainly not the last 100 years.
Up until now.
It's not up until now. That tax write-off has not existed forever. Because tax hasn't existed forever. It certainly didn't exist until the 30s. I know that for a fact. Okay, you can tell me where in the 20th century it came to be. I would argue that my bet is it didn't come to be until the 90s. Okay, so we're talking about maybe 30 years. The majority of American innovation actually happened before that. Lots of R&D occurred. Tons of R&D occurred before that. And someone's looked at it and gone, and the reason, I'm telling you the reason why.
It's amazing how you can toss so many superlatives into your sentence and say, tons of it existed. It's very easy for me to say that, millions of people are getting killed in Gaza, and you have no way of disputing it because
I would have a way of disputing it by just saying that millions of people don't live there. But the point is that the reason why new tax laws are made, as I said, all tax laws are perversions, but the reason why new ones are made is because they seek to close some sort of loophole.
I'm not interested in the reasons why tax laws. And I'm not interested in your interest.
Okay, so let's go to the bottom line. You say innovation's going to die.
The bottom line is I'm saying that it has currently severely crippled innovation just at a very fundamental financial level.
And I'm disagreeing and saying to you it will do almost nothing to American innovation. However,
and you are basing this on what?
I'm basing it on the fact that innovation is not reliant on tax breaks and never has been. Okay, it may help. It may help.
So again,
it's not the be all and end all. And I'm using examples from the previous century of tons of innovation.
Now let's go back to the law of diffusion of innovation.
And I use tons there because there was literally tons of innovation.
You're familiar with the law of diffusion of innovation?
Yes.
Okay. Right.
Well, explain it. Because maybe not everyone is.
Okay. So the law of diffusion of innovation very simply says that 2% of any given populace are innovators. Only 2%. So that's the starting point. Now, if you consider, we have, 55 million people in this country? Okay, so out of the 55 million people that we have in this country, what is 2% of 55 million? Quick maths calculation. Come.
You're the maths genius. You're busy doing.
No. Come on.
It's 1.2 million people, whatever it is.
Well, right. Okay. So half of that figure, but let's say that we have 500,000 innovators for argument's sake. Okay, just as because
2%, right? 2% of 55
but you discount the kids, and so fine. So let's end up with, let's say that we have 500,000 people in our populace right now who actually have the ability to innovate stuff. But we look around us, do we see 500,000 innovators around? The answer is no. Why is that? Because of the law of diffusion of innovation. Because in order for that innovation to actually gain currency and become mainstream, you need to hit a critical mass in terms of that 2% of the populace being able to convince a further number of the populace that the idea that they have is a good idea. Okay, so the 2% then need to influence at least 13% of the populace to buy into the idea. And once that 2% gets the third, well, no, wait, let me finish this.
Yes, all right.
Okay, once the 2% persuades the 13% to buy into it, that's the point at which you hit critical mass, because then the idea actually takes off. Because then you have that overall 15% who then provide an example to early adopters, and the early adopters then give rise to an early majority. The early majority then gives rise to a late majority. And then at the end of it are the laggards who are never going to buy into the idea to start off with. These are people who still complain about the fact that they can't get rotary dial telephones anymore. So, but this is a very real thing. Now, so in order for any country to be able to grow that 2% of innovation, you need to be able to get to that 13%. And the way in which you get to that 13% has to be a very important part of the development cycle. Because once your product actually then reaches mainstream, there's no escaping the tax net.
Okay, but America is not the only country in the world, and other countries innovate, and they don't have this tax law. So I think the focus on the tax law is, and that's what I'm trying to say to you, is I'm sure it will have some effect. I'm sure there are some companies.
John, you see, you're missing a very crucial point. Okay, and the crucial point is that it doesn't matter how innovative you are or how good your particular idea happens to be until you can hit that critical 15%, which is your...
Don't change it from 13 now.
No. So 15%...
I will point out that this is... for a conversation that has basically said universities are pointless and we must move out into the Overton window, which says that universities are... outside of the Overton window, which understands that universities are pointless, we are literally having a business course discussion right now with a law that doesn't actually exist, that was invented by someone who thinks it's true, who came up with 2%, who came up with 13%, all of which might be complete bullshit, which is based on some business course studies, which in certain cases worked out, but may not. In some cases, you might have countries with 0.01% of innovators, and you might have 10% of the population buy in, or 20%, or 100%. Certainly population numbers would matter, right? If I've got something I want to sell that's a new innovation, for example, and in fact I've got a friend, I'll give you an example that's a real life thing that exists. He came up with a software program basically, and he's selling it to schools. And I won't get into too much of the details, but that's what he does. And if it really took off and he managed to sell it to all the schools he could possibly sell it to, then he'd be a very, very wealthy man. But at the same time, if he just sells it to a reasonable number of schools, which is not, it's not 13% of the population, not even 5% of the school population, he'd be more than happy, because he'd make a decent amount of money for himself on an annual basis. He'd be comfortable. And so I hear you. I'm sure that stuff applies. I'm sure you've Googled in the meantime or found the research.
No, I was just checking Investopedia to see what they have on it. And yes,
and what did they say? What's the percentages?
No, I haven't gone through the percentages.
Right.
I just wanted to make sure that we could point people to a place where they could read up on it, because it's a substantial body of work.
I think we're having an argument about something where the disagreement is not that fundamental. So I don't disagree with you that innovation needs to be fostered at some level, all right? And the reason why, for example, you have so much innovation in the IT space from the United States is because Silicon Valley exists. So that's a place where they've reached critical mass. It is the critical mass. Okay, Silicon Valley, if you want to innovate there, it's encouraged, it's funded, there's VC, etc. We're not disagreeing on that. We're having a mild disagreement about whether a tax break will have this giant implication. I think the bigger implication on innovation and what will destroy American innovation, or not destroy it, but it will become secondary in the world where it has been primary for so long, is really the rise of a country like India, which has relative freedom, which is what actually drives innovation in America primarily, in my opinion. it has relative freedom, it has growing wealth amongst its people, and so we've dealt with the bottom level of Maslow's hierarchy, and we're not looking for a roof and food anymore. We're now starting to deal with existential things, and it has a massive population who are very intelligent and generally well educated through old school schooling. but that's for me is the rise of the future. I'm very sort of bullish.
You see the curve, and again, I'm going to go back to
and then we must call it soon, because this has been a long one.
And so the difficult thing comes in terms of trying to get us to focus on the core concepts that I'm talking about out here.
Yeah.
Okay, so the core concepts.
Sorry, I have ADHD.
Okay, so the core concepts, we started off by talking about my premise that universities as we know them are basically obsolete because, again, in terms of the 80-20 principle, the majority of degrees that they're churning out add no real value to society. So let's park that. Then the second thing is we did a comparison in terms of, and in my view, I was very clear that you have, as a starting point, the Chinese are producing a significantly larger number of papers. You made a point that qualitatively the Chinese are substantially worse than the West, which I'm very happy to concede. But I'm also conceding the point, making the point that, again, in terms of the 80-20 principle, that based on the fact that the sheer number of papers that the Chinese are producing, 20% of a larger number is bigger than 20% of a small number. And therefore, on that level, the Chinese are actually outgunning US Western academia in terms of papers. Then I went on to say that in terms of what has made the United States great, it has been the ability of the United States to foster this culture of innovation. And let me tell you why the legal stuff actually matters. You're absolutely correct. So you consider that tax is an abomination, and we shouldn't be looking at that scenario at all. But the question in terms of why it is that we don't have that degree of innovation happening in South Africa, as an example, it's because of the fact that we are effectively taxed on our ability to innovate. So if you are launching a startup in South Africa, and as soon as you hit that critical mass of 30 employees, what happens at the point at which you hit 30 employees? BEE kicks in. Mm-hmm. What happens at the point at which BEE kicks in? You're no longer able to hire on the basis of a meritocracy because you have to actually cater to the numbers. Mm-hmm. And at that point, you suddenly have skills development levies and all of this kind of stuff that kick in, and your ability to then pour the bulk of your resources into the actual innovation just goes completely out of the window. Now, the strength of the United States for the longest time is that it did not have that underpinning, that you could actually do a startup, and because you're putting your money into measurable stuff, and look, buying additional capacity from Amazon is a measurable. You are taking revenue that you're getting and you're immediately pouring it back into something that is visibly buying more compute cycles. It's something that the accountants are not able to fake.
Yeah.
Okay, because you actually have the invoices that go with it and you can see the outflows. And it allows people to then say, okay, I'm investing in so much more compute cycles. Okay, how then can I refine the model in terms of the processing that I'm doing in this particular piece of tech? And it means that you've got a critical advantage over people in any other part of the world. Because trust me, the laws that hamstrung us currently in South Africa, you have variations on that in every part of the world. So India, as an example, yes, to a large extent has a great degree of personal freedom, but not commercial freedom. And that has been the critical difference. It's the reason why you have all of these people from India who go across to the US to become innovators there, because the underlying commercial framework in India doesn't currently allow for that to happen. It doesn't allow for it to happen in this country right now, in our country. The places where you do see those things actually taking off. So there's lots of innovation in terms of what is happening on the East Coast. So if you look at Kenya very specifically, they're doing lots of innovative stuff in terms of medtech, okay, in collaboration again with the Indians, because the Indians are coming in and setting up those businesses in Kenya because it's easier for them to do it in Kenya than to do it back in India. So this stuff actually matters. And I'm saying that you're going to have a period over the next very short space of time where you're going to have an increasing number of failures on the part of startups. So right now, work on the assumption that out of 10 startups, only one will actually succeed. Just work on that assumption.
I'm not convinced it's a bad thing, but okay.
No. But it's the way in which venture capitalists work. Okay, so you have a venture capitalist who has $1 billion to invest. Okay, they pick 10 potentially brilliant ones. 9 of them fail, but one of them becomes a unicorn, and you've immediately gotten your money back. It's a very good business strategy, and it's worked very well in the American context for the longest time. Now, you're going to have a scenario where the potential for that one to become a unicorn has actually been cut in half, in my estimation.
You're pegging that entirely on one tax law.
I'm pegging it entirely on one tax law because the immediate impact on your cash flow, and all of us, trust me, having started businesses in the past, cash flow is the single thing that will end up tanking your business. And when you have something that has such a drastic impact on your cash flow, it is going to have immediate consequences. It has been an area where for the longest time, the U.S. has had a critical advantage around the rest of the world, and they've actually yanked out the rug from underneath that. And so it's already been identified in Silicon Valley as something that is a problem. It's almost impossible to get those things overturned simply because of the fact that, in order for any law to be passed currently by Congress, you have to have this ongoing process of negotiation, which is, that's fine, I will change this law if you are going to give me X amount of money for Ukraine, if you are giving me X amount of money for Israel, if you are giving me X amount of money for the border wall, and you end up with a 6,000-page bill that then gets submitted, of which this reversing this tax cut happens to be a single paragraph, because the U.S. lawmaking framework has been basically broken.
Yeah, I mean, cool. I'm gonna say let's agree to disagree. I like the idea that you point to, and as I say, the reason why people come up with laws is because they see a problem, and they don't just invent shit. Okay. They either see a problem or they believe in some reality that would be created by that law. And so the reason why that tax law exists is because there was obviously some issue with it.
Well, I can tell
from
you
the people who collected taxes.
I'll tell you the reason why it exists. Okay, the reason why it exists is that when Trump came into office, he wanted to pass sweeping tax cuts, which he did almost immediately. So now understand what happens when tax cuts gets passed. Okay, it immediately creates a deficit in terms of revenue that accrues to the state. Now, if the state is not cutting back on expenditure, okay, those tax cuts effectively mean that you are always going to have a shortfall in the budget, which means that effectively you're kicking the can down the road. And don't get me wrong, I'm in favor of tax cuts, but I'm also in favor of a corresponding reduction in terms of government expenditure. And I think you and I can both agree on this.
We agree.
Okay. So in order for Trump to get this into law, one of the things that they put in was that in 5 years from now, we'll now trigger a tax increase for businesses in this particular category that are investing in R&D, which means that we're going to have an uptick in revenue 5 years' time.
Got you.
So in other words, what they've done is they kick the can down the road for the sake of expediency, and in so doing, they created the mess that currently exists. All of which would have been fine and dandy if they had actually correspondingly cut back on government spending. And we know government never cuts back on spending.
Yes. Cool. I'm just saying, and here's what I'm also going to say is that Silicon Valley is not going to pack up. They're not going to leave. They're not going to go, oh shit, that's it, guys, it's over.
No, they're moving to Texas.
The party's over. Yeah, they're not. But those people, see, everything ultimately comes down to individual incentives. those people who exist to innovate, exist to invest in the 10 startups, exist to go to their office in Silicon Valley and come up with ideas every day, develop new things. They don't just go, oh no, guys, it's a tax cut. Or a tax increase. Oh, we're screwed. What they're going to do, some of them will. But what they will do, which is, I'll get back to what I was saying earlier, what they will do is they will go, I'm a human, and my role on this planet is to subvert complex systems. How do I subvert this? And they'll figure out a way. They'll figure out a way because the critical mass you were talking about already exists, and they will work it out. Now, will it have an impact? I'm sure it will. It will for a period of time. Will there potentially be some startups that should have made it that don't, or make it out of Kenya, or make it out of Israel, which is actually one of the biggest tech innovators in the world and doesn't have any of these things? Yes, they will. Because incentive and need are the two things that drive everything. And so I just feel that, you can focus on this as the sort of end of American innovation, or you can say, look, it's going to have an impact of some sort. Who knows what impact that will be exactly. I think it will, as I say, it will blunt some of their innovation. But I think smart oaks in Silicon Valley moving to Texas or Florida, wherever they decide they're going, are going to figure out ways around. And they're still in better positions.
It doesn't matter where you move; you're not immune from federal taxes.
No, you're not immune from federal taxes. But if you move to Texas, for example, your other taxes disappear. So maybe you turn around and go, well, we've now got this tax, which is X percentage of what we were doing, and so, but we don't have this tax, states tax, for example, that we used to have in California. There are ways around the system, and that for me is going to be a bigger influence on that. My bigger issue with the United States, the reason I think innovation is going to die there, has more to do with their cultural and social issues, which don't value a meritocracy. It's the same as our BEE problem, right?
But startup culture has always relied on meritocracy,
and they're no longer doing that to a point, and we can. But it's interesting that Google was happy to fire those people who pulled in and tried to shut down Google over their political protests. And Google was happy to say, we're not going to play this game. Now, that's very interesting because for many, many years now, all of these companies have been playing this game where they've been following the latest, greatest cultural thing, whatever it is, gender constructs or Black Lives Matter, or whatever it is, trying to get Trump out of power, or getting Biden into power, or throttling certain views online, whatever it is. They've bought into this, and maybe they're starting to see that hasn't been a particularly smart business strategy. But in my opinion, they haven't learned that at all. And the university structures have created hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people trained in all of this, who believe deeply in it. I mean, we now have our first good example in South Africa with Virgin Active this week coming out and saying, we're going to allow people who identify as a certain gender to use the bathroom that matches the gender they identify with. And you've got a stupid social media manager completely repeating that mantra online without any concern for the fact that South Africans don't really buy into a lot of this crap. They haven't been through some course at university to explain to them all of their biases.
Well, I go to the Virgin Active at Sunny Hill, and I can assure you that at the point at which a woman comes out and tells the assembled multitudes, there's a man inside the women's changing room.
There will probably be a homicide.
No, there will be an abundance of very built guys on the floor who are immediately going to frog march in there. And yes, there will be serious consequences.
There will be violence. Yeah, it's incredible to me. But I think that a lot of those people are in power now. They're in charge. They've risen to positions, HR positions, marketing positions, etc. That's why Virgin can't get away from itself. It should be putting out a statement going, we made an error. men in the men's room, women in the women's room. We will assess this is isolated cases that basically never happens. We have 140 gyms across the country, and we expect this might happen in one gym every 5 years. It's really not a big deal. We'll confront it at the time, and if necessary, we'll even consider building a neutral change room or something, and then you can choose to go there if that's your choice. But certainly we're not going to have someone walking around.
They do currently have a neutral change room.
Yeah, family change room.
Yes.
Yeah, but the problem is they'd have to rename it from family change room.
It's not a family change room. It's a neutral change room in the sense that anyone can make use of it because it's larger and it's got wheelchair access and all of that
But
kind of
the
stuff.
problem is they can't get away from this because they've got the wrong people. And America's got the same problem, but America's got this problem on sort of volume 11, whereby the entire structures of everything, from the military down to their lawmaking bodies, down to their big businesses, have all bought into this because they've got people who deeply believe it's individuals with incentives again. And so that's really the issue. Let's finish it off. You're stuck on the universities are obsolete and will die how soon, Kanthan? Within the next 10 years, you said.
No. What I'm saying is that sorry, just give me a second.
Yeah, no problem.
So I'm not saying within the next 10 years. I'm not going to put a number on it, but what I am saying is that it's going to happen very quickly when it happens. And it is entirely tied into what's happening with large language models. Again, very significant thing that happened over the past week. You had a situation where Zuckerberg basically outsourced his large language model. He said, I'm making this open source completely.
Yeah, but you know why he did that?
It doesn't matter why he did it.
I think the why is very interesting.
No, John, you see, I'm concerned with consequences, and I think you get obsessed around the why as opposed to waiting to see where the argument actually goes. What is significant in terms of what is happening right now is that by ensuring that he's put his large language model into the public domain, it's effectively meaning that he's able to continue his business, and his business is selling advertising. But he's now got an entire open source community that is going to be working on developing the underpinnings of his large language model, which in turn benefits the rest of society as well, which means that your ability to then, as individuals, take your existing online learning platforms and turn them into interactive learning platforms. And I've been experimenting with some coding around this stuff, and it's been really fascinating how quickly the back-end technology has been evolving so that I can keep modifying the model so that I'm able to shift the way in which this interactive learning is actually taking place. So if I'm doing this as a person who plays with the tech on a part-time basis, maybe a couple of hours a week, but you've got people whose full job is actually to try and work out ways of building these interactive learning models, you are suddenly going to be having this this tipping point that's being reached. Suddenly you're going to have that Malcolm Gladwell moment where it's going to be one day where 50% of the pond is covered, and then the next day there's 100% of the pond covered with lilies because it's doubling.
So perhaps I will just say the why, which is that he ran out of data, and that matters. So you can talk about what the consequences
he hasn't
are.
run out of data. He's got one of the biggest sources of data going.
He said they had run out, their language model had run out of data to learn from. And so that's also part of why WhatsApp has now rolled out, because they're going to suck all of the data off of that
So
platform.
you remember the discussion that we had in one of our early sessions where I said that ultimately where this is all going to end up is going to be based on the fact that every single model out there has been trained by scraping the World Wide Web. And the things that are going to actually make things different are going to be access to data that is not owned by any other person. And I use the very specific example of Twitter, where because of the fact that when Musk took over Twitter, one of the things he did was to close off the public scraping API. So you can get access to the data, but you need to pay for it. And Twitter is a very specific use case. Google has licensed the data that comes from Reddit. But my basic point is that if the core model in of itself is essentially the same and everyone is using it, and trust me, at the point at which ChatGPT suddenly came to market and everyone else started building exactly the same models, and you are going to have personal large language models with your data only sitting on your phone within the next short space of time. And at that point, you're going to enter what Neil Stephenson called the diamond age.
Let's see. All right. I'm going to call it there. Lots of disagreement today, but that's good. That's good. Maybe people will enjoy it. I look forward to the feedback. And I think I don't disagree with you about things changing. I just disagree with the idea that things aren't replaced by something else, which, again, with regards to universities, there will always be something. Universities are a separator. People who go to university, people who don't. People who go to certain universities, people who don't. Prestige will still creep in. You can bring language models in. You can bring whatever. People will invent and find a way. That's part of the innovation that I think will occur. But let's call it there. We can certainly continue this another time. It's been a very long one. Thank you very much, as always.
Always a pleasure.
If you enjoyed this podcast or any of the previous ones, please do share them with your friends and family. Word of mouth is important with these types of things. That's how we're growing at the moment. And we appreciate you listening and watching. As always, subscribe to the various podcasts and channels and YouTubes, etc. And we will catch you next time. Cheers.